So we're back on my performance MGB engine build, and we're back on the cylinder head again as well. Now what I need to do is start assembling the cylinder head, but we're not going to just slap it together and say it's ready to go on there. Because like any performance build, there's a lot more to it than that. And that's why performance builds cost so much more money than stock or near stock builds do. We're going to end up dry assembling this. In other words, putting all the valves and valve springs in it without the valve seals and measuring the installed height of each and every valve spring. Now these springs here are actually the springs that Moss sells as the uprated springs, which I'm not sure if they are actually the APT springs or not. I don't think they are, but they are pretty much a very similar spec to the APT springs. And with the APT, with the cam card, they actually give you the installed height of between this, was it 1 inch 560 and 1 inch 585. That way you have even pressure across all of them. You have enough spring pressure to prevent valve bounce as the valve's closing, but then you don't have too much pressure, what they call over the nose pressure, whereas the cam is getting to full lift and the lifter is going over the nose of the cam. And you don't run into coil bind. So we are going to do all that today. Now that's a bit difficult to actually measure because these spring pockets here, you can't measure from the bottom of the spring pocket to the top of the spring. So what I've done was I've made some marks here on the springs. I have measured the depth of the pocket at that spot on every single one of them. And I've recorded it all right here. So then what we'll do is we'll put each of the valves in, measure from the top of the valve down to that same spot, add this dimension to it, and that's our installed spring height. And then we can figure more than likely on this particular head, since the valves have been touched up and they're sitting a little bit further into the seats than they were before, so that we lost actually some gained volume, measurable amount of volume, that more than likely I'm going to have to shim them up. They're not going to be too short, it's probably going to be too tall. I have some shims around here. Once we know what each one of these things actually measures, then we can figure out what shim needs to go under each one of these. I can see if I have them. If I don't have them, then I can get what I need. Now I have gone through and lapped each of the valves in, because after running the CCing the head, I did find a tiny bit of water, made it through on a couple of them, so they weren't sealing perfectly. I know now I got a nice little gray band all the way around here, and you can see in the seat, nice little gray band, so we know that after lapping them in, they're sealing good. So we'll just go ahead and assemble them just like we normally would, but without the valve springs. And we'll do this with every one of them. Just go ahead and put a little bit of oil. Then there's an inner shim for the inner spring. And then we put those on here. And yeah, this is an old valve spring compressor. This one used to be my dad's. The one that I had bought years ago finally just broke. This one still works, so I'm using it. This thing has built many, many engines over the years, mostly big block and small block Chevys, but so we do that, give it a pop with a rubber mallet a couple times, and then what I'll do for every single spring is we'll then come in here and we'll measure this from this spot that I marked to the top of the spring. Record that measurement, add it to this measurement, and see what we have. We'll do that for all eight valves. So after spending several hours going through all my boxes until I found all my shims and spending the time measuring them all, figuring out what they were going to need, and working some of them over on the glass plate so that I wouldn't have to go order some more, because nothing's available local right now. I've got everything within the range I need to be in now. So it's time to throw the head on there and do some other checks. First of all, my valve adjustment. Before, these are backed off almost all the way, and actually I think one or two of them are backed off to the point where they couldn't be backed off any further. You couldn't have got another 2/1000ths out of them, but they did get me the right, it was just enough to get me the valve clearance I needed. So I rolled with it, but that's not optimal for future valve adjustments or geometry. So I have made some calculations ahead of time and got some shims from APT to put underneath them to try to get things where I need to be. But that was based on some math that I may or may not have screwed up. We'll find out. Plus, not everything's where I calculated it would be, because I was calculating on it based on where we were before, with taking, I think, 5 or 10 thousandths more off of the deck than we actually ended up taking. But we did skim some off the head, and the valves are now sitting higher in the head, which is going to change the numbers a little bit. Checking all this stuff, I'm going to be using the old pan black gasket that came off of the other engine. Now this gasket isn't the exact same thickness as the one I am using, but it's really close. These things, from what I have been told in the past, were supposedly crushed down to 40 thousandths thick, but then I've also seen people say, no, they're 44 thousandths, or no, they're 48 thousandths, and well, this one, as it's measuring now, is checking at 47. But knowing that, we know what to account for. Plus, the other thing is, this is now an interference engine. So if I ever break a timing chain, I can tag valves. But during running conditions, obviously it won't be that close. But for my own security, I want to see just how close the valves do come to the pistons when it's turning. So I got some modeling clay. This stuff's really cheap at the hobby store. We put some on top of each of the pistons, and we'll turn it over and see if it makes an impression in the clay and how thick that is. That will, just for my own peace of mind. But I do know that through the calculations, maximum valve lift will be roughly 30 thousandths below the head gasket, so into the chamber. And the pistons at top dead center will be at 15 thousandths down. Of course, the valve should never be open at the same time the piston's at top dead center. What I've done here, we got all of my lifters in the engine, and we'll set the head on, put all of the push rods in, and I'll put the rocker shaft on, rocker assembly on, and tighten everything down, but not torque it to full torque. We'll just make sure nothing's moving. Then I can adjust the valves and make sure of what we're getting. All right, so my calculations weren't really too bad. Looks like I could have went with the next thinner shim, because now my adjusters are extended a little bit more than I would like them to be. They're not really in the middle, but it's actually perfectly fine right where it's at. So now I just need to pop this thing back off and see what the clay looks like. So just as I thought, we got more than enough room between the valve and the piston, but I just wanted to make sure. So off camera, I went ahead and got the cylinder head painted, put the water pump in place, and I went ahead and cleaned up the eyebrows just a little bit here, just to ensure the airflow around them. Didn't do too much to them. I was pretty conservative. Got all the head studs properly in now. I ended up actually chasing a couple of the holes again, just because they weren't going in all the way. So now we can actually put the cylinder head on. Now, like I said before, I'm using an MLS, or multi-layered steel gasket. And I bought it from Cometic. I have used Cometic before on a jet ski I used to own, but these are not cheap gaskets. If you're used to buying, say, the pan gasket sets, they're like, what, $60 or $70 for the whole set. This is like $110 just for the head gasket alone, none of the other gaskets. And like I said before, they recommend a mating surface of 50 RA or finer. So that's why I said, if you're going to use a gasket like this, let your machine shop know, which I did. So they did do this to a finer surface than they would have if I'd have been using a composite gasket. Now they recommend installing these dry, no sealers, not to use any kind of sealers on them. And they don't actually specify here, like some of the other gaskets, top or, you know, but these gaskets are pretty much, you know, you can turn them around this way and it doesn't really make any difference. They're the same. And you can go ahead and pop it on there and take a look and look at it this way. And then you can flip it over and look at the other way, and you'll see that there is not any real difference in them, which has always made me wonder why the other gaskets say front on them when you can flip them around and they look the same. Other than the way they put the sealer on the pan gaskets, to seal it is probably why. But we'll put this on dry. Yes, I did clean the deck surface off before I put the gasket on, and I even cleaned the tops of the pistons as well. And we've cleaned the surface of the head. Now this head is actually still slightly tacky, or soft. The paint isn't completely hardened yet, but that's fine. I didn't want to wait another day to do this. I wanted to get my head on it and get it assembled. And of course, we got our spacers that we ordered to get all the valve train where we want it, and the little shims. And you guys can argue in the comment sections about whether this actually needs to be on there, but I put them on every motor I build. The factory added them in like 65 and never took them off. They had good reason for it, because it does put some slight tension on the shaft, keeping it from rotating and working. And I guess that's what this screw is supposed to be for, but it's not quite as effective as it needed to be, and this just helps reduce wear on the shaft. The push rods I'm using in this motor are the old Crane tubular chromoly push rods. I actually had bought these quite some time ago, and they were in my motor when I first built it, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, as a 30 over engine that was just balanced and nothing else special about it. And then I reused them when I went to 60 over, and now I'm reusing them again. So we get the rocker shaft, rocker assembly on there. What's holding it up? Oh, that. Now, since we are using all ARP fasteners, we have the ARP lube. This has to go into all the threads and all the washers to be able to get a proper torque on that. So I'll do that real quick off camera, because you don't want to sit and watch me just sit and do this to 15 studs. So we got these all lubed up, all the nuts are in place. And with these being ARP, they are a 12-point nut. So the size of the socket's going to change. You're going to have to use a 12-point socket. It's 7/16 on all the head studs, 3/8 on the rocker studs. So what we'll do is we'll just run these down just to take up some of the slack in the springs. Now my adjustment, now that I'm got the proper gasket on, my adjustment on this is not going to be the same as when I mocked it up, because this head gasket is thinner. So I'm going to have to loosen the adjustment up a little bit to get it where I need it to be from where I had it earlier in the video when I was test fitting. All right, so the basic torque sequence is a spiral starting from the center. So you start here and then you work your way around and out. And the torque specs for the ARP bolts is actually almost exactly the same as the factory torque specs on the head studs. So they're 45 on the studs, head studs, 25 on the rocker studs. I like to start out and just go through the whole torque sequence at 20 pounds. That way everything's pulled down nice and even. And then take it up to the 45. And you can count as you go through here that there's 11 head studs and 4 rocker studs. So as you're counting, you can count as you're torquing, just 1, 2, 3, 4. When you get to 11, you know you've gotten all of the head studs. You don't forget where you're actually at and whether you've gotten all of them. And it doesn't hurt to go back around and check them all one more time, but they should be fine. I have noticed on some things that you torque, second time around you'll get a little more, usually not with head studs, but and of course, once the motor's in the car and gone through a few heat cycles, or with most customer engines, I say just 500 miles. Then we go back, check valve adjustment on everything, and retorque the cylinder head. And don't forget to put the little retainer on here that keeps that set screw from backing out. That's something that's not that hard to forget. All right, so I need to make sure now with the lube on there, it can feel a little funny because it'll feel like as it's clicking like it's still wanting to slide a little bit, but that's the whole point of the lube, to reduce the friction so that you're getting an accurate torque. So for this particular cam, they say to set the valve lash between 18 and 20 thousandths. So initially here, I'm starting at 20 thousandths. And once I've got the motor broke in, then I'll maybe change that to 18 or 19 thousandths. But for now, we'll stay at the maximum that they recommend, 20 thousandths. So we'll lubricate everything up here. And as you can slide rockers back and forth when they're not pushing on valves, and get some in here. So we are now ready to put the valve cover on this thing, and go ahead, thermostat housing, side covers, and all the other stuff on the outside of the motor, and it'll be about ready to get off the engine stand here. Now I have this nice old school aluminum Moss Motors valve cover. I've seen a few versions of these over the years. Some of them have the MG emblem as a separate piece, like it's the wheel motif from like the magnet, or not the magnet, and other ones are molded in like this one, but I don't see these things very often. I picked this up at MG 2016 for like 20 bucks. So it's cool. What I do when I'm doing valve cover gaskets is I like to glue the gasket to the valve cover with some, gasket sealer, and I'll set it on the workbench and put a little bit of weight on it and let it sit overnight. And then we put a little bit of oil on the surface of the, that's going to touch the head, and we can put it on. Now I'm just going to put this on there temporarily right now because we'll probably have it off later, but I want to make sure this is closed up so we don't get any dirt in it. We'll put the thermostat housing on. I will not put a thermostat in it right now because I have found problems with some new thermostats. My preference for breaking a motor in initially is no thermostat. I have had them stick closed before on me, and then the temperature just goes way up real fast. So whenever you install a thermostat, always pop it, make sure it moves before you put it in. Interestingly enough, it was a fail-safe one that was stuck closed the last time I had one. So I usually end up putting them on with no thermostat housing. That way, when I break the motor in, if I've got the timing just a little off or it's running just a little lean, it's got a little longer run time before the temperature gets up too high where I have to shut it down. And it gives me a little bit more time to get the cam broke in. A lot of people don't seem to understand the actual role of a thermostat. A thermostat is there to control, not just to control the temperature. It's not going to control the top temperature. It doesn't matter if you put a 180, 190, 160, that is not going to control the ultimate temperature that the motor runs at. All that does is basically control how fast it comes up to temperature, because your motor is going to run at, say, 190 anyway. You put a 160 in, it'll open at 160, and it'll just take that much longer before it goes from 160 to 190. If you leave the thermostat out completely, it just takes longer yet. So the thermostat's not regulating final temperature. It's just essentially regulating how fast the temperature is rising in the motor to get it up to temperature, because a cold motor does not run efficiently and the motor doesn't circulate that well, or the oil doesn't circulate so well when it's cold. So you block off the flow and it circulates just within itself, and the temperature of the engine comes up a little faster, getting the oil temperature up until it reaches that temperature, whatever temperature your thermostat is, and it opens, start flowing water. Now on the side covers, I do like using the later side cover here with the silicone rubber gasket on the rear. And I always like to use the little cups and rubber seals underneath the bolts. But for this front seal, I do not like the silicone rubber ones, because I find they squish around and move around and don't always stay in position, because they don't fit the back of this cover so well. So I always use the cork gasket. Use a little bit of gasket sealer on the back side of it here, and then we'll put it on and I'll let it sit overnight with just a little bit of pressure on it to make sure that the gasket sealer dries up and is stuck there good. Then I'll take it off, do a little bit of oil around it, put it back on, and then tighten it down. And the number one cause of these leaking is either misalignment, because they're not quite straight, leaving a corner open, which is really easy to have that happen on this front side cover with the rubber seal, but also over tightening them. You over tighten them, you change the shape of them, and then they never seal. So probably over tightening is probably the number one cause of these leaking.